It all happened here. Launch Complex 34, Cape Canaveral, Florida. January 27th, 1967, early evening. America was supposed to be on its way to the moon. Instead, it suffered its first operational fatality. 3 astronauts were to die here on Pad 34 before the evening was out. And America's space program was going to come to a dead halt. And the Russians, once again, seemed to be ready to beat America to the greatest prize of the whole space race, putting a man on the moon. It was called mankind's greatest adventure, and this was to be its stepping-off point, Pad 34 at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. This was where the human race would take its first steps to leave the Earth behind and venture to another world, something people could only dream about before. The United States had been in the manned space business for only a few years. First with the one-man Mercury back in 1961, which proved it knew how to get into space.
The United States launched its second manned orbital space flight at 0745 a.m. Eastern Standard Time here today. This is Mercury Control.
Right now, 6 is about 10 feet above it to the left of 7 now. We're just flying nose to nose.
Then the country progressed to the 2-man Gemini program, which proved that American astronauts knew how to rendezvous and work in space.
Roger, Jim.
Now the National Aeronautics and Space Administration had to prove it could pull off the technological master feat of all time, actually go to the moon. The program that was going to do that was the 3-man Apollo. The prototype of the lunar spacecraft was this one, which would go down in history as Apollo 1. It was being put atop its rocket booster only 5 years after President John F. Kennedy took the country by surprise in a historic speech before Congress.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
Well, I recall listening to the speech in my car in Florida at Cape Canaveral, and as I heard him make the statement, it was May 25th, 1961, committing to get a crew to the moon and return them safely to Earth, I turned to the gentleman sitting in the front seat with me and I said, you know, we got our work cut out for us.
Referring to Kennedy's schedule to reach the moon before the end of the 60s, created, back in 1961, created a sense of excitement, but there was also a sense of, yeah, we needed to, it was a great goal, so let's see what we can do about accomplishing it in that time frame.
You know, we only had 16 minutes of spaceflight experience, and that was Al Shepard's suborbital flight, and the president says, we're going to go to the moon. You know, and that was a quantum leap way over here, and we call it Apollo.
The young president had inherited a war. It was called the Cold War, and the space race was a pivotal battlefield in that conflict. Few people knew it at the time, but one of his first official acts as president, he had been in office just 90 days, was a memo to Vice President Lyndon Johnson, plaintively, almost desperately, asking if there wasn't some way to beat the Russians at their own game, space exploration. Is there any space program, the young president asks, which promises dramatic results in which we could win? And then 10 words that were to put the whole might and wealth of the United States behind the space program. Are we making the maximum effort, the president wanted to know, Are we achieving necessary results? There was only one place left to beat the Russians. They had already garnered most of the space laurels. They were the first in space with Sputnik back in 1957. Then, just days before the fateful memo, they had put the first human in space, cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin. If you wanted to upstage the Russians in space, there seemed to be only one way left to do it: get to the moon before they did.
People forget the fact that the Apollo program in its purest form was a battle in the Cold War. We would have never gone to the moon in the time frame that we did had it not been for the Soviet threat and the Soviet competition. So there was a lot of pressure to get it done and get it done right. I would not willingly risk my life simply from the standpoint of exploration. That wasn't in me. What motivated me at that point was the Cold War, and I thought the concept of our society remaining free was worth the risk.
The men of Apollo were not just astronauts. They were also cold warriors. The 3 astronauts for the first manned Apollo flight were already national heroes. 10 days before the simulated liftoff, they were paraded for their last photo op at Pad 34. Virgil Grissom, 40 years old, known as Gus. He was to be the commander of the first manned Apollo flight. An Air Force lieutenant colonel, he was one of the original 7 American astronauts. He had flown in both the Mercury and the Gemini programs. He was the old hand. In 1961, he had been the second American to go into space. They almost lost him on recovery when the hatch blew on his Mercury capsule. It flooded with water and sank. The accidental detonation of the explosive bolts on his Mercury hatch would start a chain of events that would become a part of Grissom's destiny. Gus Grissom knew he had a dangerous job.
There is some risk. I recognize it, but just try to take as much of that out as we can during the pre-testing to make sure the systems are good. We recognize that there are unknowns and things can happen that we haven't planned for.
Grissom's second in command was Ed White, 36 years old, the All-American. The son of a general, he, like Grissom, was also an Air Force lieutenant colonel. 2 years before, he had become the first American to walk in space when he floated out of his Gemini capsule more than 100 miles over the Pacific. He was a national celebrity, thrust into the spotlight by a nation still excited by exploits in space. And the youngest of the group, 31-year-old Roger Chaffee, the rookie. This would be his first space flight. A Navy lieutenant commander, he had dreamed of flying in space since he was a kid. He was the one who had designed the patch for Apollo 1, long before there was any flight to be named, the flight that was never to be. The 3 Apollo astronauts knew their spacecraft better than they knew their own homes. They had been with it through its construction at the North American Aviation Plant in Downey, California. But there seemed to be bugs in it.
Well, there had been a lot of problems with the spacecraft. This was the first, manned vehicle, first specimen of the spacecraft, and there were problems of not only design, but there were problems, of course, with the workmanship and so on in the spacecraft.
Gus come to me, and after he'd been with the spacecraft in California, and then when it came back to the Cape, saying, there are a lot of things wrong with this spacecraft. It's not as good as the ones which we flew earlier, the Gemini and the Mercury spacecraft. He said, this is something different about this thing. And we would say, of course it's different, Gus. It's a brand new spacecraft. But it's your responsibility to tell us and the engineers what you find specifically wrong. And things will be fixed. We're not going to launch you unless everything is perfect. Rest assured of that.
But Gus and And Ed and Roger had lived with that spacecraft, and they were, you know, they were as knowledgeable as anybody in the whole world about that spacecraft. So I'm sure that they felt it was safer. They wouldn't have gotten in it.
The astronauts were more than just knowledgeable about their spacecraft.
I mean, we got down and dirty in the development, design, and the testing of spacecraft. I mean, we got our hands big time dirty in terms of working with the engineers, working with the test people, knowing the people who were designing and building, putting the users' input. Because, you know, we were all aviators, and although we didn't have a lot of knowledge of what it was going to take to go to the moon, we probably had as much as anybody at that point in time, and we're learning more each day.
By January of 1967, everyone seemed to feel that most of the bugs had been fixed in the first Apollo.
As far as our assessment was concerned, as far as our knowledge at the time, the things were done to meet the necessary specification before we proceeded. That was our actions in Florida, and usually backed up totally by the designer and the plant producing it.
The plant producing it, North American Aviation, the premier aeronautical manufacturer. The man running it, Lee Atwood, a recognized aeronautical engineer in the business for almost 40 years at the time. At 91 and long retired, he searches records and writes about Apollo 1, trying to make sure his old company does not go down in history as designing a fatal spacecraft.
Things are not on schedule. Things had been changed. There had been redraws of the drawings and many things like that, which is not unusual at that stage in something that's brand new. And the allegation was made that we were wasting money by having too many people employed. Those two things, the schedule and wasted money and effort, were the primary criticisms, and I was doing everything I could to address those things.
No one had ever built a moon ship before. There was no model to go by. It had so many parts, it seems, that people lost count. Some technicians say it had 2 million. Some say 3.
Well, at the time, I think it was the most complicated machine that had ever been made. We had a computer on board that is absolutely elementary by today's standards, and I'm sure that the Apollo pales in comparison to the complexity of the shuttle. But at that point, it was indeed the most complicated machine that had ever been used by man.
It would truly go where no man had gone before. Once out of Earth orbit, it would have to use a different system of navigation. Earthbound or even Earth orbit celestial navigation would bear no relevance. Some experts say it was the only true spacecraft in the sense that it would not just orbit the Earth, but leave this world and travel out into space to another one. It would take more power than could be imagined. Previous spacecraft traveled at more than 17,000 miles an hour to attain Earth orbit. That would not be good enough for Apollo. The lunar spacecraft eventually would have to shoot away from the Earth at an astounding 24,000 miles an hour to escape Earth's gravity and get to the moon. That speed would be like circling the Earth in just 60 minutes. On an actual flight to the moon, astronauts would climb on top of one of the most powerful devices made by man. The giant booster rocket would be filled with 6 million pounds of propellants, kerosene, liquid hydrogen, and liquid oxygen, which combined have the equivalent power of 6/10 of an atomic bomb. Everyone knew how dangerous everything was. Everyone knew that a fatal accident could eventually occur. Every astronaut felt someone would get killed.
All of us in the early days knew that there would be a time when things did not go right, and things would not go right to the point where you had a tragedy. There was a prediction, I think, as I recall, that if one flew 100 manned missions, that probably 5 out of the 100 would result in some kind of catastrophe. So all of us knew in the back of our minds that it would happen someday.
We subjugate fear to apprehension. Had a whole bunch of apprehension. But the point is, if you have fear, you're out of control, and you can't afford the luxury of being out of control.
The last thing in the world you want to do is to get killed or die, but there is also something that may be more important than your life, and that's the mission. You want to get the mission done.
The 3 astronauts of Apollo 1 knew the risk, but they also knew that they had a mission. It's January 27th, 1967. The 3 Apollo astronauts are to take their spacecraft through a simulation of their actual flight scheduled in 4 weeks. The Saturn 1B rocket booster, poised under the Apollo spacecraft, is not even fueled.
We had classified it as a non-hazardous test. We literally had in our minds, with the experience we had had on the Mercury and Gemini, and the oxygen itself did not present a hazard. That was a blind spot.
They have been breathing pure oxygen through their portable environmental suits for several hours now. This is to purge their bodies of nitrogen, which under extreme pressure changes can start to bubble in the blood, causing a potentially fatal condition known by all deep-sea divers, the bends. The normal air we breathe is roughly 80% nitrogen and only 20% oxygen. On this fateful day, as in these previously filmed simulations, their command module is also pressurized with 100% oxygen.
We had chosen, since the start of the space program, to pressurize spacecraft prior to launch with 100% oxygen. It was done primarily to create an environment where no nitrogen could get into the bloodstream of the astronaut. Fortunately, we didn't have any problems with it during the Mercury and the Gemini programs.
No one ever realized the magnitude of what we were doing and how we lucked out, really, in Mercury and Gemini.
There was a sense of, well, you know, a ground test, you don't worry about that. Things can go wrong, and you can get those fixed. And you really don't get totally concerned with problems until, getting close to launch day.
The full rehearsal before you do the launch was essentially what this test was. They also call it plugs out, where they unplug the spacecraft from external power supplies. So it runs on its own power supply. To do that, you have to close the hatch, and you pressurize it with oxygen. Now, the way we had done Mercury and Gemini was the same way we did that particular vehicle. We pressurized it with a little bit more oxygen pressure than sea level. Well, sea level pressure is roughly 15 pounds per square inch, so you put a smidgen more, like 15.2 pounds per square inch. Anything in that kind of pure oxygen will burn. You can burn steel wool in there.
I'm sure we gave some thought to the fact that that was a pretty high density concentration of oxygen, and that put us in somewhat of a dangerous situation, but I don't know that anyone ever thought that we'd really confront any major danger problems or life-threatening problems until we lifted off the pad, until we were in space.
The Apollo 1 test went through the entire afternoon of January 27th. There were problems all day long. The biggest one seemed to be with communications between the spacecraft and the outside world.
Okay, we're ready to pick up, Chuck. About all we can do is give it a try. You copy? No, I didn't read you, Chuck, at all. You want to try the phone? How about flying? How are you going to get the moon? We can't fly between 3 buildings. I can't hear what you're saying.
By early evening, pure oxygen had been soaking through everything in the spacecraft for 5.5 hours. Jess Owens, an Apollo engineer, had been at Launch Complex 34 all afternoon. When he returned to the stripped-out remnants of the booster pedestal after almost 30 years, his memories of that day came flooding back.
I was on the 8th level, and I heard one of the crew members say, "Hey, there's fire in here." And all of us were just stunned.
At this time, We're in a blockhouse away from the pad, cannot see the spacecraft directly, but through television cameras can see it. I was looking at the portal in the door of the Apollo spacecraft and saw a white, I'll call it flash.
I heard the pressure vessel relief valve over on the side of the command module let go, and we knew what was happening then, overpressurization.
In later tests, investigators would film these reenactments as they tried to reconstruct what had happened. The oxygen-soaked material inside the spacecraft seemed to ignite all at once. In seconds, the temperature soared to 2,500 degrees. Everything was in flames, giving off toxic gases, building up pressure. The accident Gus Grissom had had with his Mercury flight now came back to haunt not only Grissom, but the entire Apollo 1 crew. The hatch had been redesigned to open inwardly.
If the pressure increases inside the spacecraft as compared to no pressure outside, the hatch will seal tighter and tighter. That was the calamity, of course, that developed when the fire started. There was no way you could open that hatch again until that pressure was relieved within the spacecraft.
I started to turn to my left, and a sheet of flame. I mean, this now is all faster than much faster than I can tell it. And a sheet of flame went out to my left, and I didn't see anything else because I had turned then. My outward had been burned, my clothes, and singed my hair, my eyebrows.
The spacecraft was rupturing from the intense pressure and heat, blowing out the side near Roger Chaffee's couch. Once there was an opening, the pressure and oxygen escaped. Fresh air flooded in, the fire went out. But it was too late. Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee were dead. They had not burned to death. They were asphyxiated from the gases in the exploding spacecraft. In 5 minutes, America had lost 3 heroes, and its space program was in shambles.
Of course, that terminated everything we did, literally brought the whole space program at that point in time to a screeching halt.
It was the first fatal mistake NASA had ever made. In 6 years, it had made 16 manned flights without an astronaut getting a bump on the head in a spacecraft. And now, disaster.
Well, I didn't believe it. I mean, it was just one of those things. It couldn't possibly have happened. We were doing so well, and even though we knew that the spacecraft had some technical difficulties, it just, you don't really worry about losing lives when a spacecraft's sitting on the ground going through a test. It was hard to believe right away.
I never thought about the fact that an accident like this could happen on the ground. It was the kind of thing that I think went through our minds that if something's going to happen, it's going to happen on the way to the moon, or it's going to happen in space, or it's going to happen when you lift off, or when when the parachutes don't open and when you come home. We were sort of prepared for those kind of things, but not prepared for fire on a pad. It was just proving us that we're not infallible. I mean, we just took a big hit. We just lost 3 guys, and they hadn't even had a chance to get off the pad. So we knew we were vulnerable. We weren't sure what happened. All we knew is there was a catastrophe, and these 3 guys had just been killed. And of course, I guess somewhere along the line, we all probably, underneath our grief and concern, were wondering, what does this mean for the space program? Where do we go from here? What does this mean for Apollo?
Americans would grow accustomed to funerals for heroes in the 1960s, including one for a martyred president. Today, there would be 3 more. It is January 31st, 1967, 4 days after the tragic fire on Pad 34. Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Gus Grissom is brought to the gravesite at Arlington National Cemetery by a horse-drawn funeral carriage. He is given full military honors. He leaves behind his wife, Betty, and 2 sons. Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Ed White, from a proud military family, is buried at his beloved West Point, overlooking the Hudson River. He is survived by his widow, Pat, a son, and a daughter.
Almighty, the Father, the Son, and the Holy
And later
Spirit
in the day,
be upon
Navy
you.
Lieutenant Commander Roger
you
Chaffee is
always.
buried back in Arlington,
Amen.
leaving his wife, Martha, a daughter, and a son.
After the memorial services and after the Arlington burials and all that got sort of put behind us, we had to come to grips with the real world and take a good look at where we were space program wise. I mean, if the families were still obviously grieving, there was a lot of healing that had yet to take place. But those of us who were still in the program and committed to get the job done, from the management level on down to the people putting screws in the heat shield, had to take another look at where we're going and how we were going to get there.
The burned-out capsule was taken away to be inspected and analyzed. NASA immediately impaneled a team to investigate the fire. One of its high-profile members was astronaut Frank Borman.
We think what happened there was probably an electrical short down in the lower equipment bay near Gus's, near the command pilot's left foot, that created a spark. And of course we were with 100% oxygen at PSI of around 21 pounds, so that spark propagated rapidly and became an explosion. And I think that was the most exhaustive investigation to date in either aircraft or space. We did everything, but we could never find the exact cause. And here you had the spacecraft, everything was there, but it was very difficult to, we think we know what happened, but we can't say for sure.
The investigating committee released a report that ran 3,300 pages and weighed 19 pounds. It made several recommendations, including designing a new hatch that would open outwardly and quickly. But it did not address the oxygen problem head-on. It said that the idea of using a 2-gas system, nitrogen and oxygen, in future spacecraft would be studied. Congress was told by NASA that it had changed many of its procedures.
We advised the committee that we now have over 20,000 hours of experience in test time with a single gas system, that we have many hours with manned, over 3,000 hours with man under these test conditions, over 500 of these hours under sea level conditions. However, as a result of this experience, we are analyzing again and reviewing again a 2-gas system, and we are also examining ways of changing the accessibility to the cabin.
But that 2-gas system had already been studied. The contractor for the Apollo Command Module, North American Aviation, had started designing the spacecraft with a 2-gas system from the beginning. And this was the reason. North American had built the X-15 rocket plane, and it had experience with fire in cockpits. Its test pilots breathed pure oxygen through their helmets, but their cockpits in the X-15 were filled with pure nitrogen, which douses fire better than water. In this ground test, the X-15 pilot was protected by what engineers called his island of safety, including the nitrogen atmosphere.
Valve malfunction. Throttle off. Recess.
The X-15 test pilot here would walk away from this explosion and fire. Dr. Toby Friedman was North American's flight surgeon. He had argued with NASA to restudy their practice of using 100% oxygen under pressure in their spacecraft before launch.
I was naturally concerned about the potential risk of flame up to and including explosivity in the Apollo mission.
NASA ended further discussion in 1962 while Apollo was still in the design stage, with this memo ordering North American to delete all nitrogen provisions and to provide a cabin atmosphere of pure oxygen.
And we came to a standoff from the get-go because I insisted that this trade-off be done, and they insisted that 100% oxygen be used. And this was based on their experience operationally with Mercury and Gemini. So they felt fairly confident because of the good experience in those missions.
NASA had many reasons to go with one gas, as it always had in all of its spacecraft. It was cheaper to build a one-gas system. It made for less weight, and it made the engineering much simpler. And by 1967, 16 manned safe flights was ample reassurance of its safety. The public, and even most NASA officials, did not know there was an option.
100% oxygen question, I only know that Gemini and Mercury, which were certainly open, common, and were in a paper, were discussed and known, and it was 100% oxygen. And I'm not aware there's ever any discussion of doing it any differently on Apollo until after the fires.
NASA was criticized for not allowing an independent investigation to take place, but the agency had a reason.
We were in a hurry, and there were no people as well educated as NASA itself. We would take probably a year to teach someone all of the things that were going on in the program. So it was a case of who else could do this.
We were the most knowledgeable people investigating ourselves. We had an expert from the Bureau of Mines who knew more about combustion than anybody in the world. We had an expert from Cornell. So although the head of the committee was from NASA, we had the most knowledgeable people that the country could provide in their individual fields on that committee.
There are, as you indicate, those matters that are, call them technical and operational in nature.
In congressional testimony, NASA publicly absolved North American Aviation of any blame in the fire, but went on to criticize its management, engineering, and design.
I felt that the top management of both the corporation and the division were not giving sufficient attention to the details of the direction and execution of these contracts.
I share that concern. North American believes it would be a disservice to the many thousands of dedicated people.
It led to a lot of changes in the way NASA was run. It led into even more changes in the way that North American was run. And it led to a massive amount of changes in the spacecraft.
North American was forced to fire the head of its space division. But the president of the company says the problem was not management or design. He still contends that if pure oxygen had never been used in the spacecraft, all the other problems would have been moot.
If it had been air and not oxygen, the fire could not conceivably have taken place. This has been proved and demonstrated before. So that is basic departure point for the cause of the fire.
NASA had decided it would take greater control of everything after the fire. It appointed a crack group of engineers and administrators to ride herd on future development of the Apollo spacecraft.
After the investigation of the fire, I was sent out to North American to head up what we call the Tiger team, which was basically there on site to make certain that the changes that were mandated by the change board in Houston flowed through smoothly in actuality.
After the hurried investigations and hearings, NASA and Congress wanted to get on with it. They still had to beat the Russians to the moon. American officials knew from intelligence sources that the Soviets were already into a long pre-launch countdown for the first flight of their moonship. It was called Soyuz. The American public may not have known the whole story, but they wanted to get on with it too.
And the American public, although they may not have been aware of the details of what the Russians were doing, you've got to go back to the day that Sputnik flew and how terrified and shocked and humiliated and indeed challenged the American people were as, you know, what are we going to do about it? The entire world looked to this country that says, what are you guys going to do about it over there? The Russians just put up, the Soviets just put up something in space, and it's pretty mysterious, and we don't know what it means, but what is America going to do about it? I think we had the same feeling. We felt the same public opinion feeling after the Apollo 1 fire.
As the Americans were wrapping up their quick investigation of Apollo 1, Soyuz 1 was being readied for liftoff from the Soviet Space Center at Baikonur. In early spring of 1967, it seemed that once again, the Soviets were poised to beat the Americans in space. In April of 1967, while America was still mourning the loss of its 3 Apollo astronauts, the Russians were rehearsing their first steps to the moon. But fate was about to step in. Veteran cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov was to be a pivotal figure in their moon program. He was a national hero, having been one of the pioneer cosmonauts. He had been ceremoniously decorated in Red Square for his space exploits. Now he was to get the prize assignment. He was to pilot Soyuz 1, built to test lunar procedures in Earth orbit. What Komarov learned on his flight would be used to get a Russian to the moon. On April 23, 1967, 86 days after the Apollo 1 fire, Soyuz 1 was launched from Baikonur, the secret Soviet space complex. The Russians did a lot of things differently from the Americans. First, they used a nitrogen-oxygen mix for their atmosphere inside the Soyuz capsules. And instead of batteries for power, like the Americans used, they deployed solar panels once in orbit, relying on energy from the sun to power their craft. That was the Russians' mistake. On Soyuz 1, the panels did not deploy properly. Komarov lost power and tumbled through space. On his re-entry, his Soyuz 1 plunged to the ground, killing him instantly. The first Russian step on the ladder to the moon, like the American one, ended in tragedy. In just 3 months, the 2 nations racing each other to the moon had lost 4 men, and both space programs were stalled. Things were even. It set them back a lot, and it gave America the chance to forge ahead.
We were on a fast track. The president said we're going to get to the moon by the end of the decade. This was 1967. We had 3 years, 67, 68, 69 to get to the moon. We hadn't even flown an Apollo spaceship yet. We were sort of overcome with constant schedules. We got to get there. The spacecraft was too heavy, and we didn't have enough time. We were pushing.
The main push was in overhauling the Apollo spacecraft.
There was a whole slug of changes that were made, not simply to improve the safety, but to improve the vehicle. There were, all of these things were waiting out here, and under the umbrella of the fire, they got put into what we call the Block 2 spacecraft, which was an improved version of the one that burned.
NASA poured almost $500 million into redesigning the Apollo spacecraft, including a new hatch that could be opened in 3 seconds.
The changes that were made subsequent to the fire were very, very significant. We changed the hatch so that there could be easier emergency egress in the event of another problem like that. We changed the environmental control system. We changed the whole interior of the spacecraft with some newly manufactured paint and fabrics that would not burn, even in 100% oxygen. It was a vastly different and much improved spacecraft.
Of all the changes made, probably the most important was in the command module's atmosphere. NASA finally developed a two-gas system of nitrogen and oxygen for the spacecraft, at least for use when it was under pressure on the ground.
So you breathe pure oxygen before you launch, you breathe pure oxygen during the launch, and you breathe pure oxygen during the flight. We changed that, obviously, after the fire and went to a nitrogen atmosphere of 80%, 20% oxygen. And as we went into orbit, we replenished the leaking gases that leak out very, very slowly, but they do leak out, with pure oxygen. So after about, well, maybe 10 hours in orbit, you were back in pure oxygen. But interestingly enough, if I put my fingers like this as a candle flame, notice there's a convection current that causes that to go up to former point. There's no convection in weightlessness, so the flame just sits there randomly and doesn't get gas to support itself, it burns out.
Wally Schirra, as backup to Gus Grissom on the Apollo 1 flight, was selected to command the first true flight of Apollo, an Earth orbital exercise to test lunar procedures and hardware. His two crewmen, Walt Cunningham and Don Isley, had also been on the backup crew for Apollo 1. Their flight would be designated Apollo 7, the flights between it and Apollo 1 being unmanned. On October 11th, 1968, 1 year and 9 months after the fire on Pad 34, 3 astronauts were back up there being sealed into an Apollo capsule. Gunther Wendt was in charge of what they called the closeout crew, the men who buttoned up the spacecraft.
We had to go through a large number of tests to verify that, yes, we have corrected all the problems we had on Apollo 1, that we also have learned from Apollo 1 on not how to do things.
S4B test complete.
Now, Apollo 7 actually carried a large burden with it, because most people involved realized if we have a problem with Apollo 7, that the whole Apollo program may be canceled.
Super, Tom.
When Apollo 7 was launched, America held its breath. This time, everything worked perfectly. Apollo 7 cruised for a letter-perfect 11-day flight. But it was the fall of 1968. In 14 months, the 60s would be over. America still had to get to the moon. That's what the 3 Apollo 1 astronauts had died for. The moon was still the prize. By the end of 1968, with 1 year to go on Kennedy's self-imposed deadline, the Russians still could beat America to the moon.
The Russians at that point in time possessed the capability of orbiting the moon. And I think the feeling was that if they orbit, although with the problems they had in their big booster for their landing capsule, we figured that if we can look at a timetable that'll get us to the moon by the end of '69, we'll beat them to the surface of the moon. The question was, are they going to beat us to an orbit around the moon?
For propaganda bragging rights, it seems a simple loop of the moon was as good as landing on it. The Russians had redesigned their Soyuz spacecraft for a vehicle they hoped could beat America to at least circle the moon. The next Apollo flight was to be commanded by Frank Borman, with Jim Lovell and Bill Anders on his crew. It was to be another Earth orbital flight with more tests. But NASA decided to leapfrog the schedule and scramble Apollo 8 to go not into Earth orbit, but lunar orbit. America was not yet prepared to land on the moon, but it was certainly ready to go there.
We were told about it in August and asked what we thought about it. And there was great hope to get it done before the end of the year, because the CIA had picked up the information that the Soviets were going to try to circumnavigate navigate the moon before the end of the year in one of their spacecraft. And it turns out, subsequent to the end of the Cold War, that's exactly what they were trying to do.
The crew of Apollo 8 became the first humans to visit another world, the first to see the backside of the moon. And on Christmas Eve, 1968, Frank Borman moved the planet Earth by reading from the book of Genesis.
In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep.
After reading from Genesis, he wished the Earth a Merry Christmas from 240,000 miles away, circling an alien world.
And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth.
Мы все могли делать раньше, чем...
We could have done it before Borman and Lovell, before them, even by 6 months.
И даже на целых полгода.
Alexei Leonov, the cosmonaut who had been scheduled to beat Apollo 8 to the moon, says he could have done it. But Soviet space officials would not make the gamble like the Americans did.
Я был уверен, что мы должны раньше облететь.
I was sure that we'd be the first there. If only we had different leader, we would have been first to fly around moon, as everything was ready. Absolutely everything.
Seven months after Apollo 8, in July 1969, the flight designated Apollo 11 was launched to the moon, with Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins aboard.
City feet, 2.5 down. Straight shadow. 4 forward. 4 forward. Drift into the right a little. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. I'm going to step off the limb now.
On July 20th, 1969, only 8 years after President Kennedy had promised that America would put a man on the moon, Neil Armstrong stepped from Apollo 11's lunar lander to put the first human footprints on a different world.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
There was a unique point in history where everything came together, the support of the people, under the emphasis of the Cold War competition, that allowed us to contribute not only to the winning of the Cold War, but to the basic knowledge of mankind.
Neil took that first step. He took the first step off the shoulders of the Apollo 1 crew, as we all did. Apollo 1 was a major, significant contribution, and sadly enough, maybe because of the course of events, a greater contribution to the entire Apollo program than had it flown and been a success.
Hippity hoppity, hippity hoppity, hippity hopping over hill and dale.
Gene Cernan, commander of Apollo 17, was the last man to leave footprints on that alien world.
I've always felt, and I'd always said, and I believe it today, had we not lost the Apollo 1 crew, we probably would have lost somebody somewhere else on the way to the moon. Had the Apollo 1 tragedy not occurred, I might not have been making those steps on the moon on Apollo 17.
And the Apollo 1 tragedy inspired a silent oath.
Let's never let this happen again. Let's take all the mistakes we've learned from the Apollo 1 fire and put them into a spacecraft that is safe and sound and capable of getting the job done. And history will bear out that that's exactly what we did.
If you go back to Pad 34 today, you will see a desolate reminder of the Apollo 1 sacrifice. "Abandoned in place" is stenciled on what's left of it. government lingo for do not move it or restore it. Leave it right here as it is. If you go at the right time on the right days, you can walk under the booster pedestal and look up through the blast pit where Apollo 1 sat, and you'll see a foreign world drift directly through the opening. The moon. It comes by regularly, as if looking for those first 3 Apollo astronauts who never made it.